Good morning and welcome to episode 10 of BuiltPlace's Housing Conversations. I'm delighted today to be joined by Richard Berridge of Blackbird RE, and we'll be talking about the build-to-rent market. Richard, good morning. Thank you for joining me. And so I'm just looking at the BPF stats here that's showing that so far the build-to-rent sector it's built 43,000 homes in up to the first quarter of 2020, which is quite a substantial increase on where it has been, but it's still quite a small fraction of the overall private rented sector. Yeah. Is it the future of private renting, or is it always going to be a niche part of it?
Well, that's probably a pretty straightforward question to answer in a way, and the fact that I think what one has to do is to look at the impact it's had already, and that isn't just around the numbers, that's around how renting is now viewed amongst many people, and it's also had an impact on just the general PRS in terms of how tenants are viewed now. A lot of people don't like to use the word tenants, and build to rent tend to use the word residents or customers, that sort of stuff, and that's how they treat people. So from that point of view, it's had a big impact on the PRS generally overall at the moment, in the way that the relationship between the landlord and the tenant has really evolved into one that's much more of a consumer product. So that's one thing that has changed and is here for good. So that much better relationship between the two. In terms of the future of renting, in terms of its mass, it hasn't reached the scale that many commentators thought it would reach. I think that the BPF and Savills thought that by this stage we'd be at 200,000 homes, either finished in planning or in construction. We're not. We're some 40,000 below that. And there are a lot of reasons sort of around why that hasn't quite happened. The other issue is that the PRS hasn't grown in the way that many commentators expected. For instance, we were at about 20.4% of housing in 2015, 2016, we're now down to 19.4%. So in actual fact, the number of PRS homes has actually fallen in the last 4 or 5 years. So the growth of the sector hasn't really happened. However, what we have seen is pressures on the buy-to-let market. And since 2017, we've lost about 230,000 homes from the buy-to-let market, and we've also seen a reduction in those sort of private landlords. So you can see that even though we're at 157 homes from build to rent in terms of finished, under construction and in planning, we're still not actually making up that gap with the numbers that are actually falling. So the growth, as I can see it at the moment, is going to be based upon replacing the numbers of private landlords that are going to, I think, fall away over time. I think if we look into the future private renting, we can see that, if we take an example from the United States, the institutional or the multifamily market, which is similar to the build-to-rent market, now represents something like 47% of all rented homes. Now, we represent, or the build-to-rent sector represents, about 2 to 3% currently of all rented homes. So there's a lot of growth to happen within that. So even if we don't see, the private rental sector reach 25% of all homes, which I don't think we will, let's say it sort of hovers around the 20%, I think it's going to be by replacing the buy-to-let market more than seeing growth in the sector per se.
Yes, and it's clearly a real opportunity there, given the private rented sector generally is very broad, but it has an awful lot of very small scale landlords who own 1 or 2 properties, and the quality of that is very poor, and so a kind of an institutionally managed good quality block that is run, it's kept refurbished and well maintained is good. But one of the challenges the build to rent sector has, I suppose, is its perception as to it very much delivers housing into the top end of the private rented sector. It's only for the most affluent, the wealthiest of renters. And I was wondering if you could talk about the circumstances that led it to focus on that, the early days of the build-to-rent sector, and maybe what directions it's moving into now?
Well, I think, as we've discussed before, that when you were sort of looking at this market, it was around 2015, it was still quite a buoyant market for house building, generally speaking, and that tends to mean it's going to be a very competitive market. So in order for build-to-rent to compete, and it was one of the real big issues very early in the sector, is how to compete with the open market sale sector, where the metrics were very different around build-to-rent, and the receipts were deferred much later. And of course, the yields, based on the sort of numbers that the open market sales guys could create, were probably too low to be acceptable at that time. So in many ways, that created an opportunity for those people who looked at a more premium market. And we don't like to use the word premium terribly much, because it does sound as though we're talking about only rentals for the upper echelons. But in order to kickstart this industry, we had to look at sort of quite amenity-rich blocks, which offered an awful lot more than the mom and pop sort of landlord could ever hope to offer, along with much better management, much better communication, and much greater security. So there's a whole thing around that. But it was really driven by the fact that they had to compete, with the open market sale in many ways, in order to be able to achieve the right sort of rentals at that time. And it just meant it became really upper decile rentals that they were going to have to charge in order to make the whole things viable. Fortunately, we're now looking at a different market. And although we still have a very competitive land market, it doesn't favour so much the house builder, although Help to Buy has helped them quite a lot. So it has sort of distorted the market a little bit. But we are looking at people like Sigma Capital, who are sort of fundamentally, although not wholly, sort of based in the Northwest, and who tend to do houses as opposed to apartments, who are offering a much more affordable model. So are Granger. They're doing much more affordable stuff. And people that I work with now, when we're looking at viability, we are not looking at premium rents. We're looking at market rent. And I think most people now are looking at market rent. There will still be all those guys who do offer, and there's a real place for it, for a really high quality stuff. But that's, it's the same. It's, from, Harrods to Primark, there's a big market for everything. And so, but the biggest market will be the mid-market, and that's the market that will compete much more with the mom and pop stuff.
Yeah, and one of my understandings, and it might be more based in the market that I spent a lot of time researching back in 2015, was that in order to compete with those the yields, the effective yields that investors, buy-to-let investors, were paying, was that you couldn't just look at the income stream of a build-to-rent investment. You also had to look at an exit value, and particularly an exit value in the industry, VP value, vacant possession value. So effectively open market sale, splitting up the block into individual units and achieving the full price. Is that still a feature of the market, or have we I think matured?
RICS have released so much more guidance on this, and I think a lot more people now are much looking at a cash flow model. It's interesting. I was talking to an investor about 2 weeks ago, and I think he has a scheme in Nottingham or Leicester. And he was discussing the fact that the discount cash flow model actually threw up a higher value than the VP model. And we had quite an interesting conversation about how did the valuer feel about that, given that he's talking about residential, and the instinct for valuers around residential is to default back to VP. So, and he said they were very comfortable with it, and the fact that it is now regarded as an investment, asset, and valued as such. So I don't think we're having quite the same issues as we had very early on. That's not to say there aren't still issues around it, and some valuers will still have a different view. But generally speaking, I think people are looking at it much more as a commercial asset.
Yeah, so you're better able to compete in the land market now than you were maybe 5 years ago on that
Yeah,
basis.
that's fundamentally based on sort of a long horizon holding, and as we discussed earlier, sort of a lot of the big institutions have got 40-year horizons. So, that's going to smooth out any of the hiccups slightly earlier on in the scheme. And as they sort of hold the scheme with the knowledge that residential rental has a very consistent, very predictable curve, that is going to smooth out any of those issues at an earlier stage, and they know exactly what they're going to get back. It's an interesting thing as when sort of compared to other asset classes. Residential is not the most spectacular performer unless you're in the open market sale part of the business, which is a bit more of a roller coaster. But the residential investment market is surprisingly stable, and there isn't much of a curve in it. It's pretty much a straight upward line right the way through. And if you look back in history, it doesn't perform spectacularly well, but it performs in a way that a pension fund would like. Predictable. It's predictable. It has a very high occupancy rate. The costs of management, I suppose, are slightly higher, but then again, you have to build those in at the outset, so you know what those are going to be, and they are lazily, I admit, but around 25% for most blocks, less for managing houses than they are for managing flats. Of course, you can do it slightly less. But from an investment point of view, if you were a pension fund, it would be very difficult not to look at build to rent as a fundamental element of your portfolio because of its predictability.
Yes, I suppose the management point raises the issue of the affordable housing provision and how you manage that alongside your market rent housing. And I know that there's been a lot of different approaches from build to rent specific affordable housing tenures to either create or then creating your own registered provider to manage it yourself, or perhaps other options. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what the market's doing in that regard.
Well, government sort of came up with something. The industry itself sort of pressed the government around this because, of course, originally we were talking around about affordability because we had concerns over viability at the beginning. So, and we've discussed the viability issues, but affordability, providing affordable housing, obviously impacts upon viability. So when we talked to government about this, we sort of came up with a discounted market rent concept. And that's sort of enshrined now in the MPPF and sort of guidance about how sort of local authorities should treat build to rent. And what they're sort of saying there is that we should be looking at a discount to market rent of around 20%, and that about 20% of the homes that are provided by build to rent should be discounted market rent. And because it is an intermediate product, it can be managed by the operational manager without having to be an RP. It hasn't been massively or universally successful. As you know, I mean, most of the authorities tend to have their own thoughts about affordability, and depending on the colour of the local government, then it really depends how they look at affordable housing, whether they prefer social housing or whether they prefer affordable housing. And in London, for instance, the mayor's London plan now sort of includes an element where local authorities can insist upon social housing as part of the scheme. And that's not brilliant from a build to rent point of view, because build to rent is all about holistic, fully inclusive management and blind tenure. With discounted market rent, the tenure's blind. Nobody knows who's in a discounted market rented flat, and nobody knows who's in an open market rented flat. So everybody gets the same access to amenity. And it is, in fact, a long-term discount, a cash discount year on year into providing that affordable housing. It isn't a one-off like it is in open market sales. In open market sales, you have a one-off provision, you sell it to an RP, and you're done. With built to rent, if we talk about a 40-year horizon, which many of the institutions do, we're talking about a 40-year discount of providing affordable housing. So it's quite a substantial commitment to be able to do that. But nevertheless, it's the preference because of the overall management. We don't like, personally, I don't like providing social housing as part of the scheme because it means that it has to be managed by an RP, and that it isn't always convenient or possible for an operator or an owner to convert to a for-profit RP, for instance, in order to manage it themselves. So that means it has to be built in the same way as open market sale has to be built, which means segregating the social element from the market element. And that, to my mind, is a backward step in terms of social inclusion. So I don't see how that works particularly. The other thing about discounted market rent is it is much more flexible way of providing if the local authority is prepared to look at it as an option, in the sense that you don't have to go down the NPPF guidelines. You can, for instance, negotiate with your operator, with your built-to-rent developer, to provide a range of options within DMR. So not just 20% discount, maybe 30 or 40 or 50% discount. And for those particular homes to be family-sized homes, so they say 3-bedroom or what have you. So, there is that option within discounted market rent to have that discussion. So, and because you have that discussion, to my mind, other than the specific nature of tenure of social rented homes, there isn't necessarily a reason, a purely sort of financial affordability reason, to have social rented.
And I suppose you mentioned earlier the predictability of the income stream, and we find ourselves now in an unpredictable environment.
Yeah.
And we're still trying to work out exactly what is happening now and will happen in the future. And we're in a slightly strange situation where clearly first-time buyers have been doing relatively well over the last few years compared to the few years before, not necessarily compared to historic terms, but they're now finding it much more difficult to buy their first home because of the economy and mortgage lending conditions, which on the face of it you would think ought to create some growth for the private rented sector. But then on the other hand, we've got big concerns over the future of higher education and the number of students coming, particularly foreign students coming into the country, and just people being able to move around and find new jobs and study both domestically and internationally. And so you've got a couple of different factors influencing the demand for private rented accommodation, some positive, some negative. We're seeing, and I'm sure you'll join me in commiserating over the poor quality and availability of rental data in this country. But it does look like there might be some market weakness in London coming through, with rents falling, particularly in central London. So I was just wondering how build-to-rent operators and developers are coping with the current market conditions and what they may be expecting in the future.
Well, I think build-to-rent itself is actually coping quite well at the moment, and I think that's principally because the private space that they offer is actually quite good quality. So there isn't the stress, if you like, on the whole, of being sort of trapped at home, as we probably all of us have been so for quite a while now. So most good quality build-to-rent schemes will have personal outside space, so a balcony of some sort or what have you there. So, and also reasonable amount of space inside, which sort of pretty much comply with nationally described space standards. So, really good high quality space with some good quality internal amenity, and that would mean something like a really quite high quality broadband facility as well, which again most of the schemes offer. So from that point of view, they've done pretty well. Clearly, from a lot of their sort of communal space, again, which is a big feature of their offer, they haven't been able to use that quite as well at the early stage, as lockdown eased and social distancing has become more flexible, they've been looking at ways to use it a lot more. Gyms opened recently, so they can start to have people booking times in gyms, or booking times at pools, or booking times in the communal spaces and so forth. So they can start sort of looking at things like that. And the other thing is that they've been reporting really very high rates, comparatively, really very high rates of rent collection. So we've been up sort of more or less, we've been sort of talking anything between, I think at the lowest level of about 85%, 86%, but an awful lot of them reporting above 95%, which is very high when you're talking about an asset that possibly has a occupancy rate at about, I don't know, I think we tend to build as a default 97, 98% as occupancy rate. So if you're collecting 95% of rents, that's actually pretty good. So we often look at the PRS market as a whole as a defensible asset, generally speaking. It is very counter sort of cyclical in its nature. So paradoxically, it doesn't perform quite as well in a really strong sales market for obvious reasons. But it performs comparatively well, very well in fact, to other asset classes during difficult times, because it's flexible, it's easy to move around in, you can make your choices, and you're not committed for any length of time. So it's, from that point of view, it's a really sort of strong asset class, and we're sort of seeing that at the moment. We are seeing a few changes though in behavior, and that is, and I'm sure you've probably sort of seen this yourself and read about them, and that is how people are now viewing urban locations as opposed to rural or suburban locations. And one thing that Built-to-Rent hasn't done a lot of, although it's thinking about it, it's talking about it at the moment, and that is, moving to areas which are less urban, if you like, to use that sort of phrase, moving to more sort of suburban areas where they can offer a little bit more or be closer to outside space, parks, or even National Trust space, where people will possibly starting to be working from home a little more than perhaps they did in the past. And you can see from, I don't know if it's Amazon or Google, I can't remember which one of the two, sort of recently said, we're not going to have you guys back until 2021, I think I'm talking about, some ridiculous sort of number. You guys can all work from home. Now, that's not great from a social point of view, and I think social contact with your peers and with your colleagues is incredibly important. But I think that we're probably going to see people working from home probably 2 days a week, and that wasn't the norm. But I think that what we've seen is that using Zoom, for instance, or Teams, or one of the other systems, is that people are able to connect. They are productive. They're not all, sunbathing. Well, they won't be in the winter anyway. Sunbathing at home doing nothing. Things getting done. People are being effective, and I think that Built-to-Rent is going to also change in that sense as well, slightly. It's going to be, start to focus away from urban and look at more suburban stuff.
Thanks. I suppose one final question, and I'm not intending to put you on the spot, but clearly the government policy focus on housing has been a mix between home ownership and housing supply, and it was probably heavily focused on home ownership during the Cameron Osborne years. It moved slightly more towards supply post 2015. It's slightly unclear as to exactly where it sits now, and there's a couple of different housing supply targets for England. We're not quite sure whether it's 300,000 a year or 1 million over 5 years, and but clearly there still will be a focus from a lot of particularly conservative politicians on home ownership rather than renting, of be it private or social. How do you see this government approaching housing? Do you think they're going to be more focused on home ownership, or will there be a required pragmatism given the ongoing situation we're in at the moment?
I haven't seen much pragmatism from this particular government to date, and I think that that popularism has led to a complete lack of pragmatism generally, not just housing, but most other things. So, but that's sort of putting that aside for a minute. Housing policy or delivering it is a little bit like playing a church organ. You know, you've got keyboards aplenty, you've got foot pedals, and you've got organ stops and all sorts of stuff. And it's like trying to do it playing with mittens on, because it is supremely complicated. You know, if you push one lever, another one moves in an unexpected way, and you do things that that weren't expected to the market. Help to Buy is, you know, in essence, a really quite a good idea to get people on the ladder, but really all it's done is enrich house builders, particularly. It hasn't done anything else. I would like to see from this government a much more holistic overview of housing generally, and forget really about housing targets. That's not what it's really all about. Yes, we have to produce homes, but it isn't that it has to be ownership, or it isn't that it has to be rental in particular. The rental market has to come to terms with the fact that most surveys will say that 80% of people aspire to own. You know, and so whatever we do about talking about rental as maybe an aspiration or something that they can do them, you know, something that's really coming as a genuine option, we still have to be, you know, cognizant of the fact that ownership is many people's aspirations, has been since the 1920s. You know, back in the 1920s, we were talking about 15% ownership as opposed to sort of 85%, you know, rental. And that's how it was in the UK. We are not historically a country of house owners. We sit fifth from bottom house ownership in Europe. So we're not, you know, the great house owners that we think we were. In fact, we rent quite well. The big problem we have in this country is social housing. That sat at 30% for all housing a little while ago, longish while ago. And that's now fallen to 17% behind the PRS. We have to do something about that, because clearly affordable housing, whether social housing and the PRS somehow comes together to create more affordable housing, I don't know how that's going to go. This government is in a rock and a hard place, because at the moment, irrespective of what housing policy it might have, it's in a position now where it has stimulus to deal with, and it has to stimulate the market as a whole. And so it's brought in things like an extension of PDR, it's bringing in an extension of Help to Buy, and it's hoping that these simple levers are going to stimulate the market. I don't think that PDR is. I don't think that it's going to make any difference whatsoever. Marginal gains in housing from that. And Help to Buy, I think that's going to struggle as well, because I don't think the mortgages are going to be there to quite the same extent to give that the impetus that it did. But it's got to look at how a first world country houses its population, and it isn't all about ownership, but it is about giving people's aspirations a possibility of ownership in the future. But we might have to set that aside in the near term to ensure that people housing costs are at about 30% of what their income is, which is where it should be.
Richard, thank you. Absolutely fascinating, and some real food for thought. And thank you for joining me today. And thank you to everyone for watching.
That's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.